Welcome to the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, May 21st. My name is Pam, and let's start with our first article. An oysterman's new worry. Will state's coastal plan wash out his business? By Xander Peters. In Port Sulphur, Louisiana, sun-kissed lines frame Terry Shelley's face like high-tide stains of fishing dock. Today those creases seem deepened by anger, but it's the tone of his voice that gives it away. Mr. Shelley has spent his entire working life as a commercial fisherman. Before he was a full-time oyster farmer and harvester, he spent the first part of his career harvesting shrimp and reef fish. He's seen a lot, but not a pileup of challenges like now. Back in September, Hurricane Zeta rumbled over small-town Port Sulphur, Louisiana, where the family's oyster farm and processing center are based. The Shelleys lost half their cages, and they only managed to retrieve about half of that. Already by then, the COVID-19 pandemic has temporarily halted the supply line Shelley Farms uses to sell its oysters. Now, after losing most of his oyster crop last year, Mr. Shelley has another worry on his mind. Louisiana coastal planners are pushing a $2 billion project proposal designed to fight back against the trend of persistent coastal erosion. Few argue with the motive behind the plan at a time of rising waters, increasing intense storms, and projections that annual losses of coastal land will quicken. But Mr. Shelley sees the proposed answer: letting silt-laden river water flow again back into the backwaters of Port Sulphur and other coastal communities. As a looming catastrophe for his oyster beds that depend on the current brackish blend in these waters. They know the oyster business is going to be the worst hit, he says, of state project managers. His concerns, shared by many here, signal the complexities ahead as humans prepare to calibrate anew their own engineering of America's mightiest river. The question is not just whether plans to divert water from the Mississippi into coastal wetlands will work, it's also whether it can be done with adequate steps to address the distrust and economic hardship felt by many local residents. If you don't do the project, my guess is you won't have any recognizable fisheries within 25 years, says Mark Davis, founding director of the Tulane Institute on Water Resources Law and Policy. He acknowledges the near-term challenges for people like Mr. Shelley, but he adds, if you're not reintroducing river water, you're continuing to introduce Gulf water, productively grown oysters. They exist in a band of brackish water, and we're losing it. Coastal land's disappearing. The general idea behind the Mid-Barataria Sediment Division project is simple. By carving out a hole in a nearby levee, it will allow sediment-laden Mississippi River water to reach and rebuild wetlands. This mimicking of old age process could restore some of the more than 2,000 square miles of coast the state has lost, roughly the size of Delaware since the 1930s. The resulting wetlands would act as a barrier to protect both the coast and cities like New Orleans from future storm surges, a safeguard against another catastrophe like Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The project, which would be paid for with remaining fines and settlements from the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, is a key part of the state's coastal master plan, a 50-year, $50 billion crusade that the Louisiana legislature revisits every 5 years. By 2050, officials say the project would build up to 28 square miles of marsh in Barataria Bay. Mr. Shelley laces his fingers across his chest, leans back, and mumbles under his breath. His deep Cajun accent has a way of lingering in your ear like a growl. They know they're going to destroy the business, he says. Literally destroy it. It's going to turn this area into another Lake Pontchartrain, whose nearby waters are too fresh for oystering. Seagrass roots opposition. The debate reflects America's urban-rural divide. Among environmentalists and state officials, the Sediment Division project is popular. So popular, in fact, that New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell took to the pages of the state's highest circulating newspaper last month, voicing her support for the project and master plan. This is the time to support innovation, ingenuity, and climate adaptation. This is the time to embrace living with water and to make it our great asset. It's time to get involved and protect our coast and the future of our Delta City. Ms. Cantrell wrote in The Advocate, referring to how the Mid-Barataria project public comment period is currently underway. Even so, opinions in fishing communities associated most closely with the project differ. In Plaquemines Parish, home to Shelley Farms, the council voted unanimously 8-0 against the project in April. Later that month, neighboring St. Bernard Parish Council also voted unanimously against the project. Plaquemines Parish Council members Mark Kognovic says his concerns center around the fishing industry, increasingly the community's economic backbone, as the local oil and petroleum industry is in a lull. Each fisherman is a good small business of himself, Mr. Kognovic says. It's the trickle-down effect. He's doing good, he's going to the store, he buys stuff and keeps the stores open, and they hire people. It just keeps trickling down in the community. The local rural opposition was a resounding message to the state, but it's unclear if the opposition will matter. When it comes to coastal restoration efforts, fishermen say the state has the last say. In 2013, recreational fishing charter guide Captain George Ricks helped from the Save Louisiana Coalition in response to the state's 2012 Coastal Master Plan, which included several larger diversion projects. The state can override parish governments, Mr. Ricks says. That's the sad thing. These projects are going to devastate the economies of these coastal communities, and they have nothing to say about it. The countering view from state officials, doing nothing about coastal erosion, won't help those flood-prone communities, and action needs to involve the natural sedimentation process as well as steps like depositing dredged sand in strategic locations. Brad Barth, Operations Assistant Administrator for Louisiana's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, or the CPRA, says the agency's concern is for the overall health of the Barataria Basin as an ecosystem and a place that communities will be able to call home. For all the creatures and critters and so forth, he says, we continue to lose that land, and you won't have that resource. The state coastal manager's stress does not make these decisions lightly. Unfortunately, the state has the burden to take the longer look at this to keep the place on the map, so to speak, says Brian Lazina, Chief of Planning for the CPRA. I absolutely understand their viewpoints. It's the same viewpoint I would have if I was in their position. But if you don't make these hard choices, then we know with certainty the outcome in the future if we don't put these projects on the landscape. In coordination with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the CPRA is looking at various means of providing aid to the industry. Mr. Lazina said it would come in the form of either helping oyster farmers move their operation or providing farmers with an oyster seed source. Louisiana coastal managers are also strongly encouraging community members, fisher folk included, to participate in the project's public comment period, which is open until June 3rd. Comments will be reviewed by the Army Corps of Engineers, which will then decide whether the CPRA will be issued a permit to begin construction on the project under the Corps' guidance. The CPR would then be forced to avoid, minimize, or mitigate negative impacts noted in the environmental impact statement or noted during the public comment process. Time is of the essence for everyone. Mr. Davis at the Tulane Institute doubts the various parties will find harmony on the issue, but he likens Louisiana's coastal erosion crisis to a person deciding whether to use water or chemical foam to keep his or her house from burning down. Debate too long and the house is gone. You have to make a decision, and then you have to live with the decision, says Mr. Davis, a former executive director of the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. That's where we are. For some places in Louisiana, we've already run out of time. Mr. Shelley has fought the sea for most of his life, fought the harsh weather and the unpredictability of the oyster business. Now the threat, it seems, is coming from people on the shore. A large portion of Louisiana's farmed oysters come from reefs the state owns and leases to farmers, but the Shelley family operation is different. It's among the few privately operated oyster farms in Louisiana and likely the largest. In all, the Shelley family leases 800 acres of water space from the petroleum industry. Brandy Shelley, who manages the farm and processing plant for her father, says they'd be forced to move their entire operation to the west if the sediment division project is approved, or to watch their crop of oysters increasingly dwindle. 9 out of 10 fishermen are uneducated. They can't just pick up and find a new business to go into, she says. This is all they know. This is their livelihood. They've been doing it since the beginning of time, generation after generation after generation. Even my son. Mr. Shelley doesn't see any signs yet of the state looking out for the oyster industry's future, such as by reserving off-bottom acreage for operations of his company's scale, or by offering to buy their operation out. The project expects to break ground in 2023, though that'll largely depend on the CPRA's follow-up environmental impact statement. By the time the project's complete, Mr. Shelley will be further along in the twilight of his career. But it's the people he brought into the industry, his children, including Brandy and a grandson, whom he worries about for the future. I'm lucky I'm at the end of my career, Mr. Shelley said. What he wonders, are they going to do when they get older? Start over? That's scary. For the state, the goal of saving coastal Louisiana is clear, even if the outcome for the state's fisherfolk is murky. I think the real issue here is, can we decide to do something bold but uncertain? Can we find a way to treat those people who are going to bear a disproportionate burden in some fair way, says Mr. Davis, but bearing in mind that if you do nothing and they take a hit, there will be no compensation for any sort of sea level rise. Iran attacked. Is Revolutionary Guard looking the wrong way? By Scott Peterson. In London, a veteran of 5,000 hours behind bars, accumulated during repeated bouts in prison and months in solitary confinement, Iranian Mohammad Reza Jalalpour is very familiar with the intelligence army of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and with its obsessions. So when the political activist was summoned for questioning in March, just days after being warned by the IRGC to stop helping reformists find a consensus candidate for June 18th presidential election or face jail, he expected arrest. He quickly posted a video on social media describing himself as an unimportant and low-impact citizen whose activities are not even worth mentioning. Mr. Jalalpour said, addressing his interrogator, "I'm surprised at your tyranny. At least do it in an effective way." He added, "You put me in solitary confinement many times, and you realized every time that it does not work." At a moment when Israeli agents and its allied operatives appear to regularly penetrate Iran and freely target its nuclear program, the episode highlights the fixation of the IRGC's intelligence branch instead of on domestic activists and dual citizens it accuses of espionage, providing a window into its threat priorities. The latest alleged Israeli attack, an explosion at the Natanz uranium enrichment plant April 11th that destroyed thousands of centrifuges, the second devastating strike on Natanz in less than a year, comes after Iran's well-protected top nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was assassinated in broad daylight last December. The disconnect between the attacks and the IRGC's focus in raising questions, even among staunch loyalists of the Islamic Republic, about how an authoritarian regime obsessed with infiltrators has become so vulnerable to external threats. For Iran, one root issue appears to be the cost of an ideological military force that sees itself as much more. The often hubristic self-image of the IRGC, created to protect the 1979 Islamic Revolution, has outstripped its capabilities. Looking for an easy win? Analysts say the IRGC is overburdened, having assumed more and more functions of the state. As the IRGC fails repeatedly to prevent sabotage widely attributed to the Mossad, they say it seeks to compensate by hitting domestic targets. The IRGC at times loses sight of its main mission due to its ever-expanding portfolios, says Alia Faneh, an analyst at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington. Incapable of preventing Mossad operations in Iran, the IRGC creates the illusion of intelligence superiority by hitting soft targets, such as Iranian dual nationals, says Mr. Alfana, the author of 2 books on the IRGC's rise. They are distracted and also, I think, myopic. They are looking for an easy win, says Afshan Ostavar, an Iran expert at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. They go after small potato residents or just invent them to begin with because it's something they can show the regime and everybody else. But what they have not developed is a real unity or effort and a real articulation of what the danger is, says Dr. Ostavar, author of Vanguard of the Imam, Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Other inherent security vulnerabilities, say experts, are created by widespread economic discontent and inefficiencies in overlapping and redundant state institutions. Iran's economic hardship and corruption, says Mr. Alfona, eases recruitment of the citizenry by foreign powers. It's not just them looking in the wrong places for threats, but really discounting how much discontent there is with Iran within the ranks of the government, the armed forces, the civil servants, says Dr. Ostavar. This isn't all political discontent, but it leaves people more susceptible to inducements that foreign intelligence services can offer them. Even Mossad derived a benefit from Iran's many intelligence distractions, according to the London-based Jewish Chronicle, in a detailed account of the Fakhrizadeh killing published in February, citing intelligence sources. It said a team of more than 20 spies, both Israeli and local Iranian agents, spent 8 months getting close to their target and smuggling parts of a remote-controlled gun. The audacious operation succeeded partly because Iranian security services were too busy watching suspected political dissenters, the Chronicle reported. Survival tactics. Those dots have been connected in Tehran too, raising questions like never before about IRGC priorities. Another fire at the Natanz nuclear facility. Isn't it a sign of how serious the issue of infiltration is? Asked former commander of the IRGC, Mohsen Rezai, in a tweet. The country's security apparatus is in need of cleansing. Former President Mohammed Ahmadinejad went further, asking about Iran's $1.2 billion per year security apparatus. How is it that instead of fighting off the enemy, you are standing against the people? How is it that the people have turned into the threat? The political rationale may be simple. The regime leadership is aware of the substandard performance of its institutions in the intelligence wars against foreign powers, says Mr. Alfona. But I also suspect they are content as long as those same institutions display full competence suppressing the domestic opposition, which has hitherto secured the regime's survival. The IRGC's broadening remit includes a major role in the sanctions-strapped economy, supporting regional proxy forces from Lebanon and Syria to Iraq and Yemen, building and expanding ballistic missile and drone program, and fighting a shadow war against the United States and Israel. Yet it has also found time for lethal crackdowns on protests that left hundreds of Iranian citizens dead, made spectacles of arresting dual nationals, and successfully luring dissidents within kidnapping range, and stepped into Iran's vicious political fray. Political drama. The IRGC even produced an expensive TV series called Gondo, a spy thriller that portrays it as invincible, while insinuating that the centrist President Hassan Rouhani and Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif are sellouts to arch-enemies America and Israel. Mr. Zarif dismissed Gondo as a lie, but sparked controversy in an interview leaked in late April when he said Iranian diplomacy was sacrificed to IRGC military interests. In the interview, for a government oral history project, he said the Guard's much revered Quds Force commander, General Qasem Soleimani, killed in an American drone strike in January 2020, sought to scupper the 2015 nuclear deal. Days after the leak, the IRGC intelligence agents reportedly raided the offices of President Rouhani and of Mr. Zarif and carried away documents. The political firestorm is the latest example of how Iran's deep state of security and intelligence forces, which report to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, continued to have power without accountability and dominated the weak state, writes Karim Sajpour, Iran analyst of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. While the Guard's use of fear and coercion might be able to indefinitely sustain the Islamic Republic's internal contradictions, this should not be mistaken for popular legitimacy. Mr. Sajpour wrote in The Atlantic in March. During 4 decades, the Islamic Republic proved adept at surviving, but, like many revolutionary regimes, incapable of reforming. And that creates a system-wide lack of unity that can lead to vulnerability. The regime itself is comprised between the ruling institutions and the supreme leader who sits on top of it, says Dr. Ostavar. Mr. Khamenei has not found a way to become a dictator and just impose a king-like efficiency to the system. And there's also an indigenous looseness to the system that allows these cracks and these figures that can be exploited by Israel and whomever else. IRGC efforts are complicated too, by the scale of taking on the world, or at least a significant part of it, as an enemy, says Dr. Ostavar. It's difficult for them to keep up. It's got to be exhausting because their foot is on the pedal all the time. Women Pro Soccer goes big in England. Why now? By Shafi Musaddiq. London. It was some 3 years ago when Rodney Cyrus decided to stop watching men's soccer in favor of the women's version in England instead. He had grown cold to the cynical approach of the men's game, awash with billions and churned into a product, he says. So when Manchester United, one of the biggest clubs in the world with rich American owners, finally introduced a women's team, 140 years after the inception of its men's team, he switched over. I'm aware that they play second fiddle to the men's game, perhaps much lower down the rung in terms of acceptance, history, and financial independence, he says, but there's an honesty to the women's game I like. Mr. Cyrus is part of a growing trend that may now be reaching a tipping point, thanks to a societal shift in how the British view women's sports, along with increasing investment of money and talent over the past decade. Women's soccer is set to expand beyond its previously niche following and to enter into the public consciousness more fully. More talent, more attention. A number of factors have helped push women's soccer closer to the national forefront. The astronomical growth of men's soccer has created a disconnect between players and fans, leading to many fans of the men's game finding solace in a women's game still very much rooted in its local communities. Chris Perouse, a Tottenham Hotspur season ticket holder and a steering committee member and chair of the board at the Women's Equality Party, underscores the positive experiences, attracting disillusioned fans of men's soccer alongside a different audience with younger women and families. Fans of the men's game say they're worried about the atmosphere and the aggression and how expensive it is. All of that doesn't happen in women's football, she says. One of the things I love about women's football is that we're all there to support our team rather than insult the opposition. England's female domestic talent has also flourished in recent years, with the women's national team becoming a top-flight international competitor. In the 2019 Women's World Cup, the English national team finished fourth, and just before the tournament, Barclays Bank announced the largest commercial investment ever in women's sports in the United Kingdom, with its multi-million-pound 3-year deal sponsorship of the Women's Super League, or the WSL, England's elite tier. An influx of top U.S. players has also helped skyrocket interest in the past year, with stars including Alex Morgan, Sam Mewis, and Rose Lavelle swapping the National Women's Soccer League in the U.S. for the WSL. No one could have guessed that upon their arrival at Manchester United in the fall, Christian Press and Tobin Hearth jerseys for 3 days outsold each of those the men's squad, another sign that English fans were captured by the bright stars of the women's game just as much, if not more, than the men's game. The increased talent and fan attention has drawn interest from broadcasters as well. A landmark television deal will soon see women's soccer aired on the BBC and Rupert Murdoch's Sky Cable platforms, paving the way for women's soccer in England to broaden its reach. A recent research survey found that 34% of British adults say they are now fans of the women's game, according to Barclays. You can't underestimate how important it is, says Mr. Perouse, who works as a business consultant. She predicts free-to-air soccer on the BBC will smash viewing records set by men's games broadcast on Sky and Amazon. There are some brilliant stories that we don't know about because we don't treat our female athletes the same way as we do with male athletes. This is the chance to change that. And more eyeballs will mean an increased chance of corporate sponsors wanting a slice of the action, she says, estimating that the results of the 2 broadcasting rights cycles will allow teams to be self-sustaining. Glaring disparities remain off the pitch, however. The financial viability of teams remaining tethered to their male counterparts, which can vary widely. Clubs like Manchester City, whose owners are backed by the wealth of the royal family of the United Arab Emirates, tower over others. And big men's clubs sometimes give their women's teams short shrift. When Liverpool built a new training ground for the men in 2020, replete with beach volleyball court, the women's side was excluded. Waterlogged pitches remain all too prevalent in the WSL, resulting in multiple canceled women's games in the winter, while players in the second division continue to hold down non-footballing full-time jobs while traveling long distances for games. Those players are seen as professional, but not treated as professional, says Man U fan Mr. Cyrus. And women's soccer, Mr. Cyrus says, continued to be an afterthought for soccer's power brokers. When 6 of England's biggest teams announced the ill-fated European Soccer League, only one sentence was devoted to the inclusion of a breakaway women's version without further detail. For all its challenges, women's soccer attracts both disgruntled men's fans and a new market of young women and families for its unique family-friendly climate. Players remain connected to fans in a way that honors the game's not-so-distant amateur past. Though that may be changing with the influx of money, Farrah Williams, a former England international who made her debut in 1999, retired in April, tethering the last remaining link between the amateur game and its evolved professional version. It's been a decade since most players worked part-time jobs while playing for their respective clubs in semi-professional leagues. Now there's opportunity for female players to act out in ways the male players have gotten into trouble for. For example, as England entered its winter lockdown, some elite players were found to have traveled to Dubai, United Arab Emirates, seemingly for leisure, in violation of pandemic restrictions, upsetting fans and pundits alike. The controversy was an opening of a window into the world of newfound money in women's soccer, says Mr. Cyrus. Still, a down-to-earth atmosphere distinguished women's soccer as a potential competitor to the men's game and has enabled tight-knit online communities on social media, says student Christian Moe, a keen follower of the WSL in Bergen, Norway. Through Twitter, He found solace in a community of women's soccer fans looking to get along with each other and share ideas online. I feel it's a closer community than the men's game. It's not as big, so it's more intimate. So it's easy to discuss with people. There isn't the same toxic environment. Well, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, May 21st. My name is Pam. Thank you for having me into your home. Please be safe until we come here and meet again. And as always, my wish for you is abundant blessings today.